It's Thursday, August 22nd, 2024, the biggest revision to jobs numbers since the Great Recession. RFK Jr. looks like he's hopping out, and a side of Donald Trump you don't often hear. Next on the AM Update.
By the way, I got a message for the Republicans and the justices of the United States Supreme Court. You can pry this wedding band from my cold, dead, gay hand.
That is Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel speaking yesterday at Day 3 of the Democrat National Convention. Day 3 kicked off with some terrible but inconvenient news for one Kamala Harris. U.S. job growth during much of the past year was significantly weaker than previously reported. That's according to new data published Wednesday. The Bureau of Labor Statistics revised its total tally of jobs created in the year through March by 818,000 as part of its preliminary annual benchmark review of payroll data. That suggests the economy added an average of 174,000 jobs per month during that same period, well below the previous 242,000 per month estimate. On a monthly basis, that amounts to 68,000 fewer jobs. It marks the largest downward revision since 2009. The revised data is mostly derived from state unemployment tax records that employers are required to file. The figure, which is preliminary, may be updated when the government releases the final figure in February of 2025. Gina Raimondo is the United States Secretary of Commerce for the Biden-Harris administration. She was interviewed last night by ABC News and asked her thoughts on this latest data.
When you hear that, do you potentially think that this new numbers could be a liability for this campaign?
No. When I hear that, first of all, I don't believe it because I've never heard Donald Trump say anything truthful.
It is, though, from the Bureau of Labor.
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, that is the Secretary of Commerce for your United States government, just assuming that bad news came from a Donald Trump lie and not realizing live on ABC News that came from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I'm sure Secretary Raimondo is great at her job, though. Tomorrow is another Ask or Tell Me Anything at AM Updates. You can ask me any question you want. Tell me any story you think needs covered. Again, make your submissions on my X profile at Real AM Updates. Look for the pinned tweet at the top of that profile. Now, continuing on with the Thursday edition. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is planning to drop out of the presidential race by the end of this week. That's according to ABC News, who spoke to sources familiar with the matter. Those sources told ABC News that Kennedy plans to endorse Donald Trump, but when asked directly by ABC News if he'll be endorsing the former president, Kennedy told them, quote, "I will not confirm or deny that." Sources also cautioned the decision is not yet finalized and still could change, with one source adding, Kennedy's hope, in part, is to finalize things quickly in order to try to blunt momentum from the Democratic National Convention. One possible scenario being discussed for Kennedy is to appear on stage with Trump at an event in Phoenix on Friday, though the sources caution that Kennedy's thinking could always change, and sources close to Trump say no plans for Friday are finalized. Kennedy's campaign manager, Amaryllis Fox, emailed senior staff on Wednesday morning thanking them for their hard work, but indicated the decision on the way forward has not been made. That's again according to sources talking to ABC News. Donald Trump appeared on comedian Theo Von's This Past Weekend podcast. Theo Von is a very popular comedian, and the duo discussed some things you don't often hear Donald Trump discuss, including a long conversation about Donald Trump's oldest brother, Fred Trump, and his battle with alcoholism, which ultimately led to his death. Here's 1 minute of that conversation where the duo discuss cocaine, and you don't really hear this side of Trump that often.
Well,
No, I would just do cocaine. That was really, yeah. So not just, yeah.
That's down and dirty, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it was, yeah.
But you don't anymore?
No, I don't do it anymore, man, and I'm not doing it.
Is it too much? Too much to handle?
Some of the stuff started to get a real rattle in it, too. I don't know where we were even getting it from in this country, but yeah, it started to make me feel like I was a mechanic or something.
So the thing you go back to then is alcohol for the most part.
Right, yeah, but what I want probably is cocaine, but I know that if I have a drink, then it'll be like, okay, well, I had a drink, then I can do this.
Is cocaine a stronger up?
Yeah. Cocaine
so you're way up with cocaine more than anything else you can think of.
Cocaine will turn you into a damn owl, homie, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. You'll be out on your own porch, you know. Yeah. You'll be your own street lamp. You're freaking.
And is that a good feeling? Well,
no,
it's a miserable feeling.
But you do it anyway.
On the aforementioned segment of that conversation where Trump talked about his oldest brother, Well, that's what this sounded like. And you don't often hear this side of Donald Trump.
It didn't get better. It didn't get better. I was amazed. He lived for so long in bad conditions, in terms of, I was amazed that his body could hold out. It held out, and it had bad moments. But his body was unbelievably strong that it could withstand this.
Yeah, it's a body. Your body's just so resilient.
Yeah.
Do you remember the last time that you saw him or spent with him?
I do, and
I'm sorry to ask you about it. Is it all right?
Yeah, no. It's the reason it's good talking about it is it might help other people. If it helps one other person, it's worth the conversation. Frankly.
We talk about that stuff a lot on our podcast.
Yeah.
So that is Donald Trump on Theo Vaughn's podcast this past weekend. That conversation about drug and alcohol abuse and the impact on Donald Trump's own family went on for about 10, 12 minutes, and it's worth listening to in its entirety. Those are just a couple of segments that it just illustrates a different side of Donald Trump. People I know who have discussed and actually met with Trump personally, and I've known a few different people who have done that, say this is the Donald Trump that they know in person. That's nearly universal. It's not the person that's barking at rallies, that's firing off mean tweets at 2 a.m. from the toilet. It's that Donald Trump. I wish the public would see that side of him more often. A federal judge this week blocked a nationwide ban on non-compete agreements from taking effect in September. The Federal Trade Commission voted in April to ban most non-compete agreements, which prevent tens of millions of employees from leaving their jobs to work for competitors or start a competing business. The Dallas-based tax firm Ryan LLC, the U.S. Chamber of Congress, the Business Roundtable, and other business groups sued to block the rule from going into effect, alleging agency overreach that would make it harder for companies to retain talent. U.S. District Judge Ada Brown in Dallas said the FTC had overstepped its statutory authority and called the rule, quote, arbitrary and capricious. A recent hire at the Nuclear Security Wing of the Department of Energy has previously called for disarmament policies which reduce or eliminate nuclear weapons, arguing that advancing, quote unquote, queer theory was essential to that agenda as well as important to America's national security. The Biden-Harris administration announced Sneha Nair had been appointed as a special assistant at the Nuclear National Security Administration in February of 2024. Nair believes in eradicating purported, quote, white supremacy in the nuclear field, as well as, quote, queering nuclear weapons as part of a diversity, equity, and inclusion push she believes is essential for deterring threats to nuclear energy facilities in the United States. She wrote last year, quote, finally, queer theory informs the struggle for nuclear justice and disarmament. Queer theory helps to shift the perception of nuclear weapons as instruments for security by telling the hidden stories of displacement, illness, and trauma caused by their production and testing. Nair argues that DEI more broadly is, quote, essential for creating effective nuclear policy. Before she joined the Biden-Harris administration and the Department of Energy, she worked for the Stimson Institute, which has received hundreds of thousands of dollars from George Soros' Open Society Foundations and millions from the Embassy of the State of Qatar. That's according to Fox News Digital's review of their funding sources. Utah's Republican leaders made good this week on a decade-old vow to launch a legal challenge aimed at wresting control from the U.S. government over much of the federal land that dominates the state. The state's attorney general said he asked to file a lawsuit with the U.S. Supreme Court in what is considered a long-shot attempt to assert state powers on U.S. Bureau of Land Management property across about one-third of Utah. It marks the latest jab in a running feud between the United States and the states over who should control huge swaths of the West and the enormous oil and gas and timber and other resources they contain. Federal agencies combined have jurisdiction over about 70% of Utah. The lawsuit targets about half of that federal land, some 29,000 square miles, or an area nearly as large as South Carolina. Those parcels are under Land Bureau management and used for energy production, grazing, mining, recreation, and other purposes. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln announced it's going to be closing its Office of Diversity and Inclusion. UNL Chancellor Rodney Bennett made the announcement in a letter to students this week. Quote, we will reimagine how we approach this work at UNL. I fully grasp the weight of this decision and its implications, but a centralized approach to this work is no longer right for our institution. The position of Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion will be eliminated as well. This is good news, starting to take hold not only in the business world, getting rid of DEI practices, but also in red state academia. I think that is a sign of things to come, hopefully. And finally, I want to leave you with this on this Thursday. Scott Atlas, he's an epidemiologist from Stanford, formerly of the White House Coronavirus Task Force under the Trump administration. He was interviewed recently about his experience, and man, I hate resetting this, but it needs to be said. He's asked about his experience on that White House Coronavirus Task Force. That was the one made up of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the scarf-donning Debbie Birx, and other bureaucrats beholden to anything other than science. Here's what he had to say about his experience.
That became sort of a catchphrase that my friends in the White House would say, because I said it so often. I totally disagree, because these people were completely wrong. And the sad part was they had no data. There were these sophomoric charts tabulated by Deborah Birx that a middle school student could put together with color coding, arbitrary categories of red, yellow, green, danger, risky, not a risk, but they were just arbitrary, the cutoffs for cases, for whatever the criteria was. There was no real science or scientific debate, except when I was asked a question, I was prepared with 2 scientific papers, all the data I'd gone through with the skepticism about the study designs that you're supposed to have as a medical scientist. And so when I was asked a question, I would go through the data. And there was never a single meeting, and this is sort of shocking to even keep reliving, not a single time where Deborah Birx or Anthony Fauci or Robert Redfield brought scientific papers into the meeting. Not a single time was anything I said ever refuted by criticism of the data or our alternative numbers or other data. Not a single time was there a criticism about a study being designed, except from me when I would say, of course, as a medical scientist for decades, the way you look at a study is you look at the study design first. If the study design is flawed, the conclusions are not valid. Not a single time did I ever hear Redfield, Birx, or Fauci ever criticize a study design. And even worse, not a single time did they disagree with each other, which of course is unheard of, implying that there was a groupthink going on, not critical thinking. But the bottom line of not a single time is not a single time did they disagree with me on data. The only comment was, Scott, you're an outlier, which of course is not the thinking, not a scientific argument. It's not a debate. It's not a way to have a discussion. You discuss the data. Instead, it was ad hominem, you're fringe, you're an outlier. And it's also the thinking of a bureaucrat.
That is Dr. Scott Atlas reflecting on his time on the White House Coronavirus Task Force back in 2020 under the Trump administration. If Donald Trump wins in November, we better be hoping and praying he doesn't get ruled by the people that Dr. Scott Atlas just illustrated for you. It needs to be staffed. An administration needs to be staffed by people, at least in the health world, like Dr. Scott Atlas. And of course, there are other fields as well that need to be staffed by not entrenched bureaucrats, but by competent people. A second Trump administration buys this country some time. But boy, that time is short and it needs to be used well. That's what I'm hoping for. That'll do it for Thursday. Again, Ask or Tell Me Anything tomorrow. You can ask any question you want, submit any story you think needs to be covered on the AM Update. Make your submissions on X at @RealAMUpdate. Look for the pinned tweet. Until then, that's it for Thursday. I'm Aaron McIntyre, and this is the AM Update.